Greetings, everyone. I'm Minky Worden from Human Rights Watch. My job is to oversee all of our work on sport and human rights worldwide. I also edited a book on the Beijing Olympics in 2008 and previously lived and worked in Hong Kong. I will be your MC for our panel discussion today. A few housekeeping points to kick off. I want to remind you our session will be recorded. If you have a question, we ask you to put it in the chat. Please do identify your news organization, and if you feel like it, let us know where you're dialing in from. Feel free to submit your questions during the presentation, and we will cover as many of them as possible. Now we will play a short video to introduce our discussion today. Thanks very much. I wanted to introduce our discussion today with a few words about Human Rights Watch's work on global sport. Human Rights Watch's first report on human rights in an Olympic host country was for the Atlanta Games in 1996. We regularly engage with sport governing bodies like FIFA, FIBA, the FIVB, and the IOC to encourage them to adopt human rights policies and to remediate serious human rights abuses. Over the last 2 years, we have published a series of reports documenting verbal, physical, and sexual abuse of teen athletes, including on the women's national teams in Afghanistan, Haiti, Mali, and the host country of the Tokyo Games, Japan. Last December, the International Olympic Committee published a human rights strategy. Our recommendation is it should be adopted immediately, in line with UN standards, and that if it had already been adopted, it would have given the IOC leverage and a roadmap to deal with the human rights abuses that are affecting the Olympics preparation and coverage. On Sunday, August 8th, the Tokyo Olympics will have its closing ceremonies. The torch will be passed to the next Olympics, the Winter Games in China, in February 2022. Beijing will be the first city to host both the Summer and the Winter Olympics and Paralympics. I know some of you with us today previously covered the 2008 Games in China and may be experiencing a bit of déjà vu. We have convened this discussion today because the human rights situation in China has degraded so markedly since the 2008 Summer Games. Back in 2008, there was hope, including among ordinary Chinese citizens, lawyers, academics, and athletes, that the Olympics could bring positive change to the country, especially for press freedom and human rights. Instead, 13 years later, China is in the midst of its worst human rights crackdown since the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. And the Olympics are shaping up to be a triumphal Chinese communist spectacle in the snow. Some of you have heard senior IOC leaders say the Olympics are not political. Well, we wish someone would tell that to the Chinese government. For an autocracy like China, the Olympics are not just about sport. They are a geopolitical event that can elevate the status of the government and the ruling Chinese Communist Party at home and abroad. Human Rights Watch has published numerous reports on China, most recently our report this year calling the abuses of the Uyghur population crimes against humanity. Our goal today is to provide journalists with critical information about the ongoing human rights crisis in China. Our panelists will share their expertise in a short Q&A, and then we will take questions from the rest of you. Our first speaker is Yaqiao Wang, who is a China researcher with Human Rights Watch. She is the author of book-length reports on press freedom, women's rights, surveillance, civil society. As a lead-off question, I wanted to ask you, how has the human rights situation in China changed since the last Beijing Olympics in 2008?
Thank you, Minky, for the introduction. Well, so much has changed. I think, anybody who attended this press conference knows, the drastic changes happening in Xinjiang and Hong Kong. So I'm not going to go into those regions. I'm going to spend 2 minutes just focus on that. Well, the aspects that it would very likely affect your coverage in Beijing next year. First, I wanted to use an example to illustrate how things have changed. So in 2008, during the Beijing Olympics, the Chinese government designated an area for people to protest. So some people applied to protest, but that even they applied, the protests were never able to be carried out. So one of the person who applied were a human rights activist, Ji Sijun. So in 2009, a Fujian court sentenced him to 3 years in prison for forging off official seals and documents after he applied for a permit to hold a protest at a designated protest zone. So he got out after 3 years from prison and continued his activism. In 2016, another Fujian court sentenced him to 4.5 years in prison after he helped petitioners to protest and supported a pro-democracy protest in Hong Kong. And in July 2019, 2 months after he was released from prison, he died due to illness that were very much related to the conditions in the prison. So another good example would be Ai Weiwei, who designed the stadium, the bird nest stadium for the 2008 Beijing Olympics. Now he's in exile after being persecuted by the Chinese government. So activists who were very active during the Beijing Olympics games, they were, some were passed away, like Ji Zijun, like Liu Xiaobo. Some were currently in prison, like Xu Zhiyong, like Ding Jiaxi. Some have gone to exile, like Ai Weiwei and Teng Liao. What has drastically also changed is the online environment. Foreign websites exist during that time. I was in China. I literally learned English at that time by listening to VOA, reading the New York Times, The Economist. Social media at that time was not very vibrant, but it was emerging and people are using it. The Chinese people and then the rest of the world were using the same social media or reading the same website. But today, most of those websites were blocked, whether it's Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Economist, or social media sites like Facebook, Twitter, they were gone, but the Chinese have its own versions. In terms of people, in 2008, people were proud. People were very excited about the Beijing Olympics, and there were nationalism. There were criticism, and people were unhappy. People feel it was unfair to criticize China. But there were also a lot of criticism towards the government, towards how the Beijing Olympics were carried out. During the open ceremony, a girl who appeared on the stage to sing the song Ode to the Motherland were not actually the girl who were singing the song. So there was a girl behind the stage who sang the song, then the girl appeared on the stage because at that time, the girl who actually sang the song lost her front teeth, and the government think that doesn't look good. So there were tremendous criticism mocking the government for that kind of choices. And at the time, Hu Jintao was the president. There were a lot of a mockery of the press. Hu Jintao saying this guy lacks any kind of facial expression. Now, if you criticize the president Xi Jinping or mock him in any way, you could very much be thrown to jail. At that time, during 2008 Beijing Olympics, people were quite welcome, foreigners to visit to China. They want to exchange, they want to learn from abroad, people from abroad. But now I think among the young people, especially the young generation, people feel, China is leading the world, China is rising. So there's more nationalistic feelings, there's more hostility towards things foreign, particularly Western things. I think that's a direct result of stringent censorship, blocking information from the outside the world, and more propaganda from the Chinese government providing its own narrative.
Thanks very much. Speaking of the nationalism that we see in China now, I think most of the people on this call know that press freedom is guaranteed in the Olympic Charter around the Olympics and Paralympics, and one of the requirements from a host is that a host has to open itself to scrutiny. That's part of the deal. If you want to host the Olympics and the Paralympics, you have to actually open yourself to the world and to reporters who can write what they want. And I wanted to also give the background that press freedom is included in the host city contract. It's in the host city contract for Beijing, which is a public document. And of course, the IOC has set up a press freedom complaints mechanism. So could you give us an idea, what are the current working conditions for reporters in China? How has the press corps itself changed? And what happened with this terrible incident with reporters around the Henan floods?
I think maybe many of the journalists who are in our call are currently based in Beijing, and maybe they're the people who are better to tell us how things has changed. But I think what you can, for anybody who were not in Beijing or who are not familiar with the current press situation in China, I would just say, first of all, you would expect fewer people that would be able to help you. Whether in a sense, they're fixers, news assistants, or reporters who are able to help you with the coverage, because the Chinese government are become, harsher in terms of punishing people who assist Western media. A good example is the journalist for Bloomberg. Sorry, her name just escaped my mind right now. Miss Han. So she has been, detained by the Chinese government. We haven't heard anything from her for a few months now, at least. Then among the in 2008, I believe there would be, or a lot of people who are willing to talk to foreign journalists, introduce China and introduce, the country, culture, are willing to talk about their own experience, how they feel. But I think that you very likely would be, they are less willing to talk about to foreign media for reasons, the government could punish them for saying anything critical to the Western media. Also, as I mentioned, among the population, there's more hostility towards anything Western, including Western media. Secondly, I would expect that it would be harder to circumvent the Great Firewall. The war is getting higher and higher. I know you have to buy a VPN, probably you have to buy several VPN, your VPN can get unstable. That has been going on for several years. I don't know to what extent the Chinese government is going to actually release the control of the Great Firewall. It's possible that because the Beijing Olympics was going on, they allow you to jump over the firewall easier, or they designated certain places for you to go so you can use access the outside the international internet. It's hard to say, but I wouldn't expect too much. I think the third is really the harassment to surveillance towards journalists themselves. As Minky mentioned, what happened in Henan. For anybody who's not familiar with that, with the incident last month, there's a huge flood in Henan, and some Western outlets went to Henan to interview people. Then the Chinese government affiliated Chinese Youth League asked online on social media, Weibo, to identify a BBC journalist and to basically harass him. So then not only the BBC, so people were basically literally on the streets to hunt a BBC journalist. Then some other journalists also were affected, and there were videos really, people were frightened by the situation. People encircled the journalists and, asking them why they tried to smear China. So those kind of, harassment, surveillance, whether it's from the government or from the population, could, possibly, very likely, be worse than when it was in Beijing. All that being said, I still think that would be a great opportunity to do reporting in China, especially for anybody who has been rejected by the Chinese government because of the previous episode. Like, I think, about 20 journalists from the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post have been, rejected. They have expelled because there are certain rules. Maybe Minky can explain later that would enable you to apply for a visa to to report, to cover the Olympic. Go there, use the opportunity. There are a lot of us are not able to go to Beijing to do the reporting. Please go and do whatever you needed to do to cover this great country.
Thank you very much. And we can cover the details of accreditation in the Q&A. Thank you so much. I'm happy to turn now to Rayhan Assad, who is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Strategic Litigation Project. She is the first ethnic Uyghur to graduate from Harvard Law School. And her brother, Ekpar, is currently in one of Beijing's detention camps. So thank you for joining us, Rayhan. The first question I'd like to ask is what is the current situation for Uyghurs in China?
Thank you, Minky. I wish that when we have this kind of press release, it could be a moment of triumph where we get to tell all of these journalists and our listeners that humanity prevailed, that in response to a strong public outcry from the international community, including manufacturing and entertainment industries, the Chinese government changed its behavior, that the world came together to defend human freedom, dignity, and universal values of human rights, that the camps, prisons, and residential schools have been closed for good, that broken families have been reunited, that women can get married and give birth at their own will, that children once again found themselves in the loving arms of their parents and grandparents, that I myself have been able to embrace my brother, as you said, Ekber Assad, my rock and source of inspiration in this unjust world. Unfortunately, I'm going to paint a very darker picture. 5 years into this crisis, the Chinese government, unfortunately, has not shown any sign of ceasing its repression. When it was forced to admit what the whole world saw, colossal prison camps, China scrambled to make its action legal. Innocent detainees are now receiving formal prison sentences. With lengthy sentences, with trumped up charges, sometimes even life for life, for crimes such as having a WhatsApp downloaded for excelling while Uyghur, like my own brother, an alumnus of the State Department program, which produced the likes of Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, or having relatives who have been to a foreign country. Once trapped in China's concentration camps, Uyghurs are often shipped on demand to companies across China, where they are used as forced laborer in factories. This is a modern form of slavery, and it's allowing China to turn a profit while it imprisons and terrorizes the entire people. Fashion companies, technological manufacturers, and solar industry are strongly implicated. Chinese government remains to be undeterred. In 6 months from now, it is set to host the Olympic if we don't protest. So unfortunately, and I wish I have a better news, but this is why we're here and we continue to raise awareness. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you, I think for many of the people on the call, some are based in China, but and I'm sorry to have to ask you, but what happened to your younger brother? How old is he? When was the last time your family heard from him?
Yeah, so he's actually 34. He's a tech entrepreneur, and a media founder, once actually even extolled by the Chinese government as a positive voice for humanity and a rising star in a tech world. My brother was invited to the State Department's most prestigious program that I mentioned. But most importantly, I think he wants to be known for his commitment to kids with disabilities and philanthropy. Unfortunately, I think even excelling as a Uyghur in today's China under current leadership is a crime itself. And immediately after returning from China, he's been forced into these prison camps. As some of you may know or may not know, it took me years to finally speak up about this injustice. And after a long, hard fought campaign, almost after a year later, the Chinese government finally showed my brother to my family. But in that brutal 3 minutes video, my brother looked like a shadow of his former self. He's currently held in a solitary confinement because he's a very charismatic guy. Even while incarcerated, he was able to uplift people. And I think this goes to show that this is the re-education is just a euphemism to destroy this people, the Uyghur population as a whole. The finest and brightest of the Uyghur society, Uyghur intellectuals are primary targets for these re-education camps. So there's nothing to be re-educated about, except this would lay the foundation to commit mass atrocities and crimes against humanity and destroy the fabric of any society.
Thanks very much. And I think we're going to come back to you in the question period and answer period also. We already have a question about forced labor and about the role of the sponsors and businesses. I'm going to turn now to Nikki Dryden, who is an Olympic swimmer. She's a human rights lawyer. During the Tokyo Olympics, she's been a convener of a group of global lawyers working on Rule 50 and athletes' rights. So she's been an athlete herself. She's been a working journalist. She's a lawyer. And I want to start, Nikki, by asking you, why is it that a government like China would want to host the Olympics so often? What do they get out of it? And how does this? What are the goals of a government like China in hosting the Olympics?
Well, they get moments like Michael Phelps. I was actually just thinking about, my experience. I was in Beijing 2008 as a swimming journalist, and Michael Phelps' most miraculous Olympic moment. I think that he's the greatest athlete in the world. That moment happened at the Beijing 2008 Olympics. The whole world was watching. That will be a historical note forever, that Michael Phelps accomplished this amazing feat at the Beijing 2008 Olympics. The same with, the opening ceremonies was the most amazing opening ceremonies of all time. The whole world is watching, and they're going to be validated both externally as this amazing host of an Olympic Games, creating a platform for athletes to achieve their dreams. And then internally, it's also going to validate the current regime in China, because they are able to play sort of both sides in the sense that they can showcase China internally as this, powerful regime, but also externally to the world, that they can be an international host of the whole world.
And you've been an athlete, and you help athletes advocate for their human rights. How do you think athletes are going to feel about competing in a games that are presented by the Chinese government as a validation of its brutal policies. We've just heard about, we've heard from Rehan about the brutal policies. We've heard from Yachao about the human rights, terrible human rights conditions. Is the Chinese government going to present this as a validation of their repressive rule? And how do you think athletes will feel about that, knowing they're not a monolithic bloc?
Yeah, I mean, I think starting with athletes' own security, I think that's sort of the place that I like to start first, because you can't be a human rights defender unless your human rights are protected. And so, as an athlete going into China, they're expecting to be safe. And I think if you are a Muslim athlete from any country in this world, how could you possibly feel safe knowing that the host nation is systematically targeting Muslims in their own borders? I mean, I certainly would not feel safe if I was a Muslim athlete heading to Beijing 2022. If you're a Canadian, knowing that 2 of our citizens are being detained unlawfully in Canada under what is an enormous political issue between the Canadian and Chinese governments, I wouldn't feel very safe. And so I think whether we're talking about just an athlete's right to freedom of expression, association, and movement, all of those things will be curtailed. And that's sort of not only by the Chinese government, but by the Olympic Committee. That is one thing. And then when we start thinking about, but do we really want to be competing, expressing ourselves in the true sense of the meaning, being able to accomplish our goals on the international stage, knowing that these things are happening in our name? I would love for someone to ask Michael Phelps what he thinks about the greatest moment of his life, being the catalyst for, what my other panelists were saying, the next 15 years of brutal repression that was sort of started on the back of Olympic athletes and their success in 2008. So I certainly would not want to be an athlete in Beijing 2022 whose Olympic achievements are actually the source of human rights violations of my fellow man. So I think it's really scary if you're an athlete going there for a host of personal and also, broader humanitarian reasons.
And just one more question, because you're an expert in this. What are some of the areas that athletes protest? We've all seen, of course, Colin Kaepernick and some of the contemporary racial justice demands and protests. Can you just give us a tour of some of the topics?
Yeah, so I think obviously the Black Lives Matter movement has sparked a global realization that racial justice is a critical issue, not just in the United States but around the world. But athletes have been protesting not just racial justice for over 50 years, but LGBT. I plus issues. There are athletes that have been wearing rainbow on podiums from the Olympics to World Championships for many years. Even, we can talk about what happened in Sochi, where LGBT athletes were felt very unsafe going into Russia when Russia was actively targeting that community. Athletes also protest against anti-doping. An Australian athlete at the World Championships refused to shake a Chinese swimmer's hand at the World Championships last year. So there's like a host of issues, everything from just, minorities generally. And I think one of the biggest issues for me is that the Olympics are a time when women and minorities have a unique opportunity to express things that are important to them. This is often the only time that women and minorities get this opportunity in the media spotlight. And it's really important that that space is safe and legally protected under international law, so that athletes, when they have their one earned moment of international glory, that they feel safe and free to express themselves on whatever topic that they want that is within the realm of protected free speech.
Thanks very much. So we're going to turn now to the role of business. And I think a little bit of background, the International Olympic Committee has an elaborate structure of financial supports. 73% of its revenue comes from broadcast, the sale of media rights around the world. There is also a structure called the TOP, the Olympic Partner Program, where 14 major multinational companies pay as much as $100 million to exclusively use the five rings and to be part of the Olympic system. In so doing, they also literally underwrite the games. So I want to introduce Tiff Roberts, who's a former China bureau chief and Asian news editor at Bloomberg Businessweek. He has a new book out called The Myth of Chinese Capitalism. Tiff, can you've covered companies investing in China for many years, and what pressure do companies who are particularly sponsoring the Olympics or doing business in Xinjiang face now that many governments and parliaments want answers on slavery and supply chains?
Well, first of all, I would say that the extent of pressure that companies, whether they're doing business in Xinjiang or even just more broadly in China, are facing is more intense than it's ever been. We have growing awareness, a good thing, of human rights abuses in China. And in places like the United States, we have a rare bipartisan consensus that China, some of these issues related to China, and particularly human rights abuses, need to be addressed. Also issues obviously like Taiwan, Hong Kong, China's mercantilist trade practices, all these things are very much front and center in places like Washington now. So these companies are being asked questions about their presence in China, whether they have any sort of direct role in the human rights abuses, whether they're more broadly, their supply chains are complicit in some way, perhaps by relying on detainee labor. And this is a real shift from before. For many years, I would say companies could pay only limited attention to what was the opinions and the attentions back in the home countries. That has completely changed. I would also mention that they're not just facing pressure from their own governments and from overseas actors, but they're facing pressure to a degree that they've never experienced from the Chinese government itself, and also, as was mentioned earlier, from nationalistic people in China, mainly online. So we saw examples earlier this year when a couple companies expressed concern about what is happening, the human rights tragedy in Xinjiang, and immediately were attacked by the Chinese government, no surprise, but also pilloried on the Chinese internet. In some cases, unfortunately, they backtracked, and those same companies made statements that suggested that they were not that they wouldn't step out of line, that they were not so concerned about these issues as they had initially suggested.
Interestingly, a lot of our questions do relate to sponsors, so we're going to come back to this. But just as someone who's worked in China as a journalist in the business area, for many years that was an area that was safer than, say, reporting on human rights. But do you now think that business itself, and particularly reporting on something around the Olympics that is so important to the country, is that how has that ground shifted? There was a time when reporting on the environment was safer, but that has shifted. Talk to us a little bit about how the ground has shifted for people who are reporting on business in China, and is it possible for journalists, for example, to investigate supply chains? Many auditors have pulled out. The BCCI, the Cotton Initiative, have pulled out. How possible is it to report and to look into the question of forced labor in China?
Well, I think the ground has clearly shifted markedly there. In my earlier years, many years in China as a journalist, I did a series of stories on issues like labor abuses and supply chains. And as you say, most of the major international auditing companies were active there then. There was even often, in some cases, you would actually get assistance from government officials in China who themselves were concerned about things like labor abuses, and particularly perhaps were focused even more so concerned when they were in multinational supply chains. So it was a very different world then. I think it's changed dramatically. I think as a business journalist, you do run, you're facing a lot more pressures than was the case before. Things have become so much more sensitive across the board in China, including the business environment.
Thanks very much. So I think we're going to turn now to questions, and I actually will start with Colin Murphy's question. Colin's from Bloomberg. Thanks for joining us. I know it's late where you are, where I am also. And Colin's question is, can you help unpack some of the calculus underlying companies' decisions to participate in a boycott or not? What factors are weighing up, for example, the appeal of the Chinese market versus the draw for Western consumers with a pro-human rights stance? This difficult situation that companies are put in, the cost of such a protest in terms of lost business or fees, and Tiff, I'm going to send this one to you. Do you think many of the companies will boycott? Which ones are most likely to do so? I'm going to put that to you, and then I'll take the second question about the top sponsors.
I think any companies that would consider a boycott don't have a significant market presence in China. I think we have a range of big multinationals in the U.S. whose most important market is China, and I don't need to go through all the names, but there are a lot of the obvious ones, and they're in an extremely difficult situation because a boycott, not only potentially they're going to if they were to limit their operations in China, they would, if they were to decide themselves to limit their operations in China in some way, obviously that would hurt their market share, but that's not the full story. We've seen now that when a company speaks out, even obliquely, sometimes it's hard to make the connection, but in some way that the Chinese Communist Party perceives as supportive of Taiwan or supportive of civil rights in Hong Kong or critical of Xinjiang, they are immediately, attacked. And it often happens first in the state press, and then very quickly, as I said earlier, extends into the blogosphere with patriotic commentators. Celebrities in China line up and do things like burn their shoes, Nike shoes, so they can take a tremendous hit from speaking out, and that's something that's very different from before. I think that it would be very unlikely to see major multinationals do a boycott at this stage. Having said that, I do believe that the pressure on them will only become larger and larger, and as we get closer to the Olympics, what matters obviously is if it starts to affect their share prices and their market shares back in their home markets.
Thanks. I'm going to quickly segue into another related question from Kathy Long, BBC News Beijing. Sponsorship is one of the key elements of any Olympics, and no Olympics can exist without it. Absolutely true. How do you plan to engage with the major companies? So, if it's all right, I'll take that question. Human Rights Watch has written to all of the so-called top sponsors of the Olympics, and we have written to ask them to clarify what arrangements they have for due diligence in their own supply chains. As most of you know, there are hundreds of thousands of products that are produced with the 5 rings and that will be produced for these Olympics. It ranges from the creepy Olympic mascots to the cups and T-shirts and backpacks and key rings. So a lot of things will be produced with the 5 rings in China at a time when supply chains are very opaque and reporting on them is difficult. So we sent that letter and with a deadline of June 1 and have not had an answer back from any of the top sponsors. And I think these are major multinational companies, but worth reminding, it's Coca-Cola, Visa, Intel, P&G, Samsung, Alibaba, Airbnb, and others. So I think one of the questions the second question that Colum had was, has any company pulled out of sponsorship? And I think it's significant. I don't have an example from China because we're not there yet. But one of the most significant things that's happened in the world of business and human rights was the passage of the boring sounding but important UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And all of the top sponsors are signed onto this. It requires you to do due diligence about human rights abuses in your supply chain. It requires you to monitor because that situation can change. Uyghurs can be put into re-education through labor camps. It requires you to remediate if you find abuses, pay workers who've been cheated, or if there is a death of a worker on a stadium, you need to compensate the family, and then you need to be transparent about what you did. All of the companies that are sponsoring the Olympics are obligated to uphold the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And the IOC actually, as an enterprise, is covered by them. So that's one of the more interesting things. In Qatar, as many of you on the call will know, there have been a number of worker deaths, mostly from extreme heat, but absolutely preventable. Hundreds of worker deaths in the period since Qatar was awarded the World Cup. McDonald's is one of the companies that stepped away from its sponsorship of the World Cup in Qatar and of FIFA. And I think it didn't say at the time why it was doing so, but obviously the terrible press that you get, any sponsor is sponsoring the Olympics or the World Cup in order to be associated with, as Nikki says, the higher, faster, stronger. But when you're associated with human rights abuse, sexual violence, and forced labor, that's not what sponsors are after. So I think these games are likely to change the calculus of when and how companies will sponsor these major sporting events. So I'd like to go now to, and Tiff, do you have anything to add to that? No? Okay, thank you. I'd like to go to Sam McNeil's question, and this is to the panelists. Is the government using the pandemic as a reason for more of a crackdown on human rights and limits on independent research, including Human Rights Watch's work, journalists, and et cetera? Is there any loophole to the transparency requirement in the host city contract that I spoke about between the IOC and cities hosting the games? So this is a question that will let us, I think, as a panel, speak about the Chinese government's use of the cover of COVID, to broadly speaking, in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and also to repress those who would report on public health. Yachao, would you mind to take the Chinese government's use of COVID as to cover up its activities?
Well, certainly there are incidences where citizen journalists travel to, those areas that has an COVID outbreak. Then the Chinese government forcefully quarantined them, saying, you are against the rule, we need to quarantine you. Then there are also incidences where the activist or the human rights lawyer is supposed to be released back home after a certain, serving his or her sentences. Then those people were taken again by the government to be so-called quarantined, but those people were in the prison in the first place, right? So there are reasons there. The government used quarantine to restrict movement, to restrict any kind of protests. That's for sure. Then in terms of independent research, well, I'm here in New York. So I'm not in China. Of course, there are huge, very restrictive border controls, restricting people going to China, and also for people coming out of living in China. So it's both ways. The communication between China and outside world has been, very limited. In terms of online, of course, the government is cracking down, set tightening control on the internet, using all kinds of excuses that can be, related to so-called, better COVID management. So absolutely. In terms of whether they are loophole, back to you, Minky, you're the expert.
Yeah. Thanks very much. I think there's quite a bit of the synchronizing of the crackdown in Hong Kong happened more or less with the world being very distracted by COVID. The restrictions on travel that everyone has experienced only help the Chinese government clamp down further. And I know for those of you who are based in Beijing, it's also very difficult difficult working conditions where it's difficult to see friends and family, and it's difficult to leave or difficult to come back. So I think it's certainly the Tokyo Olympics have taken place in a pandemic, and there's every reason to believe that 6 months from now we will still be in a pandemic. The big fear there is that will, for example, give the Chinese government even greater reason to reject visas, for example, from journalists that they don't like. I wanted to make sure we cover a few more questions. One of the questions from Stephen Zhang is to the panelists is, one argument we've heard is that boycotting Beijing 2022 would be unfair to the thousands of athletes who've trained for years in their once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. There's an idea of a diplomatic boycott, and for the diplomatic boycott is that high-level officials, heads of state, do not go to Beijing for the opening or closing ceremonies to give the stamp of approval to the Chinese government's policies. I'd like to send this question about a boycott or a diplomatic boycott to Rayhan, please. Would you mind to give us your thoughts about this as Uyghur?
Sorry. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
I think this is a very difficult question to answer, and like journalists and many others, I grew up. In fact, I actually grew up with a brother who loves sports and really even like idolized these athletes. And growing up, like his room has pictures of athletes from all around the world. So it would be very difficult for me to say that, like these athletes should be also stripped of their right to showcase their talent and tenacity in front of the whole world. But also the problem is like, this game is not just about them. This game is about defending human dignity. And I think we should not forget the Chinese government would make sure to showcase Uyghurs dancing and living a happy life and bring a new norm of normalcy to the current crisis. And the danger in that people would be walk away with this illusory impression of what China is and what it stands for. And that's something that we need to make sure. But despite all this deep concern and complexity of this issue, I still am not in favor of like putting athletes to completely boycott or anything. But I do believe there is a solution to this. Yeah. We should ask governments to allow the athletes to have a choice. And how do we go about it? At least in the United States, there's a fine White House tradition to host athletes in the White House. I would hope the governments would invite athletes together with human rights defenders, activists, and advocates together, especially those individuals from the impacted community. Allow athletes to hear those voices how this crisis is tearing family apart, how individuals like myself are searching for my brother, and how this has changed my own life and forced me to share my pain in such a public domain. And I think at that point, if the athletes still pursue that, it is the right decision to go to China, then I would like to ask them to find a creative way to protest, resist, and make sure, even like wearing a picture of my brother or some of the individuals who are in prison at this moment of time, and see if the Chinese government would react. And I think in front of the whole world, I hope the Chinese government wouldn't dare to do that. But if they do, I think that would send a chilling message to each one of us. This is a kind of country, and this is a new face of China. So, and I think there are ways that we can go around it to make sure that, our beloved athletes can still have a chance to shine. But also, I think before getting into that, let's not forget there are other ways. I still hope if we can postpone the Olympics for COVID, why not postpone it for crimes against humanity? Why not postpone it in the face of mass atrocities and in honor of those victims who are using every last breath to fight, in the hope that people like us, the international community, are fighting with them every step of the way.
Thank you. I want to get to Motoko Rich's question. Motoko's from the New York Times in Tokyo. What specific actions would you like to see from the IOC with regards to Beijing 2022? Nikki, over to you.
Yeah, so Minky mentioned earlier that the IOC has a strategic human rights plan. I was one of the stakeholders that was involved in the development of that strategic plan with Prince Zaid, who's the former UN High Commissioner of Human Rights. Implement the plan now. There's, they sat on the strategic plan for a long time. It was finally published at the end of last year. If that plan was put in place, human rights due diligence would be going on in Beijing and China right now ahead of the Olympic Games. And I think that for me, the IOC has really failed here, right? They had a chance, they knew that this was going to happen. China bid for the Olympic Games in 2000. They didn't get it on the condition that they improved their human rights situation. They made promises again. 2008, they were awarded it. Nothing good has happened since. The IOC is responsible for this situation. And I think that until they implement with urgency some human rights due diligence to work with the Chinese government to make progress on these issues, we have a very limited amount of time left unless we do decide to move the games, which we've now done once. So why can't we do it again? But I would like to see the concrete actions from the IOC. You cannot treat China differently than we're going to treat France, the United States, and Australia as future hosts. We have to implement the human rights strategy now, and we have to create human rights due diligence in China also right now.
Thanks very much. One of the questions is, what are the risks for visiting foreign journalists and broadcasters in Beijing? In February, Michael Smith asks, for example, could a broadcast journalist get into trouble for referring to Taiwan instead of Chinese Taipei? Mike Smith from the Fin Review in Australia. So I'll go ahead and take this one myself. So I think there are a few important points. First of all, the Olympics coverage starts now. If you have trouble as a working journalist in China right now, you need to be filing a complaint with the IOC's press freedom complaints mechanism. So that's the first thing. Your press freedom is absolute. It's not bound by the Olympics, and it's not bound by the subject area. I've seen some coverage. Thank you, Stephen Wade, AP in Tokyo, that there is an implication that somehow you can only cover sports if you're going to come to China, which is a complete rollback of all of the previous understandings and it is a total non-starter. The fact that bureau chiefs for major media from around the world are now having to cover the Olympics out of Seoul or Tokyo or Taiwan is also completely unprecedented, and let's just go ahead and say it, completely unworkable. My recommendation, our recommendation for journalists is your press freedom right is in the Olympic Charter, it's in the host city contract, and it's absolute. You should apply now for accreditation. It's usually through your National Olympic Committee, and if you're rejected, then let's have that fight. But press freedom was claimed in the, I recommend everyone should go back and read the IOC Impact and Legacy Report on Beijing from 2008. Press freedom advances were one of the claimed impacts and legacies from those games. So if you're going to claim it as a legacy, you actually have to uphold it the next time the Chinese government hosts. So I want to make sure that we're not missing any questions. Chris Buckley, based now in Sydney, sorry about that. Given the experience of the 2008 Beijing Olympics and the political atmosphere in China now, it seems likely that boycotts will fan popular nationalism in China, endorsed and encouraged by the government. How do you respond to the argument that some have made different and more focused measures would ultimately be more effective? I'm going to hand this one over and also give the last word to Yachao, who has spoken and written about Chinese nationalism and how it happens, and whether it is how to counter it. But I would also say that I remember Liu Xiaobo before the 2008 Olympics described the process of the Olympics as this hot walk of nationalism, that they actually have the effect of fanning the flames of nationalism. So Yachao, how do you answer that question?
Sorry, what do you mean by more focus and different measures? If you want to explain, sorry, I just didn't get that part.
Yeah, I think the question is there a boycott, which I should say 160 human rights organizations are calling for a boycott. Human Rights Watch is not part of that letter to the IOC, but we support our colleagues' rights to call for a boycott. The question is there something that is more nuanced than a boycott, which is very binary? You go or you don't go, right? It's a Cold War tool. So the question is, are there other tools on the table to pressure China that are short of a boycott? And Chris, I hope I've interpreted your question correctly.
Well, as you know, Nikki also had mentioned it. You know, it's athletes prepared for their life to have this moment. Taking that moment away, it feels wrong. So athletes can still go, and then there are other ways, sponsors, international dignitaries, celebrities, we think they should not go to lend legitimacy to the Chinese government for hosting this thing, while all those atrocities are going. If your question is why is this specific, everybody else not go, the athletes go is more effective. I am honestly not advocating this is more effective. I don't know which one is more effective, but I consider that athletes have prepared for their life, and they shouldn't be harmed by this. So we're asking IOC to take measures to guarantee rights and do better, rather than asking athletes to sacrifice that. But again, I'm not saying that this is more effective, or one way is more effective than the other.
Yeah. So we have hit the hour, and I know some of you are working journalists covering sport events in Tokyo and other places. I want to thank everyone for being with us today, and I want to end on a hopeful note. And the hopeful note is actually about Chinese people. The Chinese government is often conflated with the Chinese people, but we don't hear as much as we should from the actual Chinese people. They may be very proud to host the Winter Olympics following the Summer Olympics, but we wouldn't know that because there's not a truly meaningful press freedom in China to tell that story. But I do want to say that, it is quite unprecedented for an Olympics to take place in an atmosphere of such repression in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and Tibet. Repression of human rights lawyers, activists, doctors, citizen journalists, and netizens across China. And this is a lot of this repression has actually taken place since China was awarded the Olympics in 2015. So the IOC is in a very strong position to say, you've begun this repression since we gave you the games, and we want you to stop it now. The Chinese government could be pressured to free political prisoners on the mainland and in Hong Kong. Ilham Tohti, Wang Qi, the Hong Kong publisher Jimmy Lai, the Panchen Lama are just a few. There are thousands of political prisoners in China. Nikki mentioned that China had bid in the past for the Olympics. They actually released political prisoners in the past when bidding for the Olympics. But the only way that happens is if there's pressure. And the Olympics are all about, sport is all about playing by the rules, and human rights is all about the rules. So there can't be a double standard where China gets to violate human rights, crush press freedom, and still host the Olympics as if it was business as usual. Thank you all for joining us today. I imagine we'll be back in touch. I encourage you to contact any of our experts directly, and we will have a recording of this press conference in case you have colleagues who are interested to view it. I appreciate, especially for those journalists who are in China, the work that you're doing every day. We're grateful for it, and the world knows a lot more about what's happening in China because of your important work. Thank you very much, and good night or good day.